Have you ever felt guilty for wanting something before you had even acted? Not for deceiving someone, not for causing harm, not for violating another person's freedom, simply for experiencing desire. Perhaps the feeling appeared late at night, when no one else was present. Perhaps it emerged in your body before your mind had found words for it. And almost immediately, another emotion followed. Shame. You judged yourself before anyone else could judge you. You felt accused without knowing precisely what crime had been committed. That sequence matters. Desire first, condemnation second, and between them, sometimes only a fraction of a second. Most people assume that this guilt rises naturally from conscience. They believe it is evidence of an internal moral law, something pure and unquestionable, speaking from the deepest part of the soul. But what if the guilt did not begin inside you? What if it was taught so early, repeated so often, and connected so thoroughly to fear that it eventually began to feel like your own voice? That is the difficult possibility we must examine. To understand how bodily shame became entangled with spiritual judgment, we can begin with one of the most influential stories in Western religious consciousness. The story of Adam and Eve. They eat the forbidden fruit. Their eyes are opened. Yet before exile, before labor, before pain, and before the full declaration of mortality, something psychologically decisive happens. They become conscious of their nakedness, and they hide. The body becomes the first place where alienation appears. Nakedness, which had existed without scandal only moments before, becomes evidence against them. The human being begins to look at the body not merely as something lived through, but as something that must be covered, monitored, disciplined, and judged. From this symbolic beginning, a vast moral architecture would eventually emerge. Within many religious cultures, desire, especially sexual desire, became one of its strongest supporting pillars. The mechanism is simple enough to be repeated endlessly. A person feels desire. Desire is treated not merely as an impulse that must be understood, directed, or ethically evaluated, but as contamination. The person feels guilt, even before any harmful action has occurred. Guilt creates the need for purification. Purification requires obedience to an accepted authority. That authority determines which desires are permitted, which are forbidden, and what must be done to obtain forgiveness. Then the cycle begins again. Desire, guilt, confession, submission, temporary relief. And because desire inevitably returns, dependence on the authority also returns. This is where the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza becomes unsettlingly relevant. Spinoza did not produce a modern theory of sexual liberation, nor did he write the kind of cultural critique we might write today. But his analysis of fear, superstition, desire, bodily existence, and religious power gives us a powerful framework for understanding how guilt can become an instrument of domination. From a Spinozist perspective, a system that teaches people to fear their own nature does more than regulate behavior. It weakens their capacity to understand themselves. And a person who does not understand the forces moving through them becomes easier to govern through fear. Why then has sexual desire so often been treated with exceptional suspicion? Why not reserve the greatest moral anxiety for cruelty, greed, exploitation, vanity, or the hunger for power forces that have destroyed families, nations, and civilizations? Why has so much religious attention been directed toward what people feel in their own bodies, often in private, even when no one is being harmed? The answer proposed by this philosophical critique is severe. Sexual desire is difficult to regulate because it does not wait for permission. It arrives through the body. It can appear against conscious intention. It can cross social categories, challenge arranged expectations, expose hidden dissatisfaction, and reveal that the official self a person performs is not always identical to the life moving beneath that performance. Desire reminds you that there is something within you that precedes instruction. That is precisely what makes it threatening to systems dependent on complete obedience. A person at peace with their own body is harder to convince that the body is an enemy. A person capable of examining pleasure without immediate shame is less dependent on someone else to interpret every internal experience. A person who understands desire, rather than merely fearing it, becomes less vulnerable to threats of spiritual contamination. This does not mean such a person is beyond ethics. It means their ethics can no longer be based entirely on terror. A body that is understood may become the beginning of a mind that is difficult to enslave. And a mind that is difficult to enslave does not automatically accept the claim that it needs an institution to rescue it from its own existence. This is the central thread we will follow. Perhaps the guilt attached to desire has not always been primarily about morality. Perhaps it has also been about authority, about who is allowed to define what your body means, who interprets your inner life, and who benefits when you distrust yourself. To see why Spinoza's philosophy threatens this structure, we must understand the man himself. Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632 into a Portuguese Jewish family whose community had been shaped by the experience of persecution. He was educated within that religious world, but his intellectual independence gradually placed him in conflict with its accepted boundaries. At the age of 23, he was placed under an exceptionally severe ban by the Amsterdam Jewish community. The declaration prohibited members from maintaining ordinary contact with him and condemned his ideas without providing a detailed public account of every disputed doctrine. Spinoza did not respond by building a new religious sect around himself. He lived quietly, earned money partly through grinding optical lenses, maintained a small circle of intellectual relationships, and continued developing a philosophy that challenged some of the deepest assumptions of European theology. His writings were denounced. His name became associated with atheism, even though his philosophy was saturated with the concept of God. His works were restricted and attacked by religious authorities. He died in 1677 at the age of 44, and his most important philosophical work, the Ethics, appeared only after his death. The institutions that rejected him possessed pulpits, schools, laws, and public authority. Spinoza possessed a disciplined mind, a modest room, and an argument. Yet centuries later, the argument remains. What was so dangerous about it? Spinoza challenged the image of God as a supernatural ruler who stands outside nature, experiences human-like emotions, issues changing decrees, watches individuals as a judge, and rewards or punishes them according to a cosmic system resembling earthly government. To Spinoza, this image revealed more about human imagination than about divine reality. Human beings, he believed, tend to project their own desires, fears, and political structures onto the universe. Because kings command, they imagine God as a king. Because judges punish, they imagine God as a judge. Because parents approve and disapprove, they imagine the order of existence as a parental consciousness, constantly measuring their behavior. But what if God is not a ruler outside nature? What if God is the infinite reality of nature itself? Spinoza expressed this through the famous formulation Deus Sive, Natura, God, or nature. There are not two separate worlds, one physical and inferior, the other divine and pure. There is one infinite reality, expressing itself through countless forms. Human minds, human bodies, trees, oceans, planets, animals, thoughts, emotions, and desires all exist within this same order. Nothing exists outside it. And if nothing exists outside nature, then the human body cannot be treated as a foreign object, accidentally attached to the soul. The body is not a prison constructed by some opposing power. It is one expression of the same reality that the mind expresses in another way. This is where the inherited structure of shame begins to tremble. If you are part of nature, and your capacity for desire arises within nature, then desire cannot be condemned merely for existing. It must be understood, and understanding desire will demand something far more difficult than obedience. It will demand that you stop hiding from yourself. The statement, "desire is natural," can easily be misunderstood. Some hear it as permission to obey every impulse. Others fear that once desire is freed from religious condemnation, no ethical boundary will remain. Without sin, they ask, what prevents chaos? Without punishment, what prevents exploitation? Without an external judge, why should anyone restrain themselves? Spinoza's answer is not moral emptiness. It is a different foundation for morality. To understand it, we must examine one of the central ideas in his philosophy, conatus. For Spinoza, every existing thing strives to continue in its being. This striving is not necessarily conscious. A plant turns toward light. An organism seeks nourishment. A body resists destruction. A mind attempts to preserve the patterns through which it recognizes itself. This persistent movement is conatus, the effort through which each thing continues to exist and expresses its particular nature. In human beings, conatus is experienced primarily as desire. Desire is not an accidental defect added to an otherwise pure person. It is the dynamic core of human existence. We do not first exist as neutral beings, and then occasionally begin to want. Our wanting is part of what it means to be alive. You seek food because your body strives to continue. You seek knowledge because the mind attempts to expand its understanding. You seek affection because human existence is relational. You seek pleasure, connection, recognition, safety, expression, and intimacy because you are not a stone sealed off from the rest of nature. You are a living mode within a larger order, constantly affected by other beings and constantly affecting them in return. From this perspective, the first philosophical question is not, why do I desire? The deeper question is, what is this desire revealing about the causes acting within me? That shift changes everything. Under a morality of prohibition, desire is placed on trial before it is examined. It is classified as pure or impure, according to rules that may have been established centuries before the individual's birth. Under Spinoza's framework, desire becomes an object of understanding. Where did it come from? What conditions intensified it? Is it connected to loneliness, curiosity, affection, fear, insecurity, physical attraction, the desire for recognition, or the need to escape pain? Does acting on it increase one's capacity for meaningful life? Or does it create deception, dependence, conflict, and harm? These are harder questions than, is this forbidden? A rule may be obeyed without self-knowledge. Understanding cannot. This is also why Spinoza's account of joy is essential. Joy, for him, is more than a pleasant mood. It is the transition toward a greater power of acting. It occurs when our capacity to exist, understand, relate, and express our nature increases. Sadness is the opposite movement. It is a transition toward diminished power, fragmentation, passivity, or disconnection. What we call good is connected to what genuinely supports our flourishing. What we call bad is connected to what weakens, diminishes, or destroys our capacity to act according to understanding. This does not produce a morality of uncontrolled indulgence. In fact, it reveals why uncontrolled indulgence often fails. A person may pursue pleasure compulsively and become less free with every repetition. An appetite can promise expansion while gradually narrowing life. An encounter can feel intense while producing dishonesty, dependency, humiliation, or emotional ruin. A desire can be natural in origin, yet confused in expression. Nature does not guarantee wisdom. It provides causes. Freedom begins when those causes become more intelligible. This distinction is crucial because religious guilt and blind indulgence share something in common. Both can prevent genuine understanding. The person ruled by guilt says, I must not feel this. The person ruled by compulsion says, because I feel this, I must act. Neither is free. Both are reacting. One is controlled by fear of desire. The other is controlled by desire without comprehension. Spinoza's freedom lies elsewhere. It emerges when a person understands enough of the causes shaping an emotion that they are no longer carried by it like an object in a current. Imagine a river after heavy rain. A branch falls into it and is swept forward. The branch may move quickly, but speed is not freedom. It does not understand the forces carrying it. It cannot alter its relation to them. Many people live their emotional lives like that branch. They are pulled by attraction, fear, jealousy, loneliness, or shame, yet interpret the movement as a completely independent choice. They say, I decided, when in reality a chain of causes, childhood conditioning, unmet needs, social pressure, bodily states, imagined threats, has already shaped the decision. Spinoza does not insult human beings by revealing this dependence. He invites them to become more active within it. We will never exist without causes. We are part of nature, not exceptions to it. But we can become more conscious of the causes that determine us. The more adequate our understanding becomes, the less passively we are driven by forces we cannot name. This is what freedom means within his system. Freedom is not an action without a cause. Freedom is action flowing increasingly from understanding rather than confusion. Consider two people who experience a similar attraction. The first immediately suppresses it. They refuse to examine it because examination itself feels sinful. The desire does not disappear. It is buried, disguised, and pushed into areas of life where it may appear as resentment, secrecy, obsession, or hostility. Years later, this person may still be shaped by a feeling they never allowed themselves to understand. The second person acknowledges the attraction without assuming that acknowledgement requires action. They ask what the desire means. They consider existing commitments, the autonomy of others, possible consequences, their own emotional patterns, and the difference between temporary intensity and enduring connection. They may ultimately choose restraint, but their restraint is different. It is not produced by terror of punishment. It is a conscious decision grounded in a broader understanding of themselves and the people affected. Externally, both people may perform the same action. Internally, they occupy different worlds. One is imprisoned by a prohibition they dare not examine. The other acts from knowledge. This reveals why the critique of shame is not a rejection of responsibility. Responsibility becomes deeper when it is no longer outsourced to rules. If your only reason for respecting another person is fear that God will punish you, then your ethics remain dependent on surveillance. But if you understand that your own flourishing is inseparable from the flourishing of others, respect becomes part of rational self-preservation. Human beings increase their power through cooperation, trust, friendship, mutual recognition, and shared understanding. Deception and exploitation damage those conditions. They produce enemies, instability, isolation, fear, and internal fragmentation. A desire pursued through coercion cannot become genuine joy because it diminishes another person and corrupts the relational world on which your own existence depends. Consent, honesty, and responsibility are therefore not arbitrary restrictions placed against desire. They are conditions under which desire can be integrated into a life of greater freedom. This is more demanding than simply asking whether an authority permits an act. It requires attention. It requires self-examination. It requires seeing another person not as an object placed in the world for your satisfaction, but as another center of striving, another living expression of nature whose freedom cannot be separated from your own ethical life. The question is no longer merely, what do I want? It becomes, what happens to my power to live, understand, and relate when I pursue this want in this particular way? That question does not produce identical answers for everyone, but it transforms morality from obedience into comprehension. And this is precisely why Spinoza's philosophy challenged religious authority. If moral life can be grounded in reason, relationship, and understanding, then fear loses its privileged position. The individual no longer needs to imagine a divine observer keeping a secret record of bodily feelings. No supernatural punishment is required to explain why cruelty is destructive. No doctrine of contamination is required to establish the importance of honesty. No institution possesses exclusive ownership of the path toward ethical clarity. The person becomes responsible for learning how their own nature works. And once responsibility takes this form, the body is no longer the enemy of morality. It becomes one of the places where moral knowledge begins. Your tension, attraction, fear, pleasure, discomfort, and longing are not infallible commands. But neither are they meaningless intrusions. They are information about the relations in which your life is unfolding. To understand them is to understand part of nature. To condemn them before understanding them is to choose blindness. And blindness, Spinoza believed, is exactly the condition in which fear becomes politically useful. Fear is among the most powerful forces in human life because it narrows attention. When frightened, people rarely examine the entire chain of causes surrounding an event. They focus on the immediate threat. They search for protection. They become willing to obey whoever promises safety. Spinoza understood that superstition flourishes most intensely where fear and uncertainty are strongest. When people cannot predict what will happen, they search for signs. When suffering seems without explanation, they imagine hidden intentions. When life appears unstable, they become vulnerable to anyone who claims to know what invisible powers demand. This does not mean every religious experience is fraudulent or every believer is manipulated. Spinoza's target is more precise: the use of fear and imagination to convert uncertainty into obedience. Sexual guilt becomes especially effective within such a system because it attaches fear to something that cannot be permanently escaped. You can avoid a prohibited location. You can stop reading a forbidden book. You can distance yourself from a political enemy, but you cannot permanently leave your own body. Desire may return, despite prayer, discipline, marriage, age, social status, or sincere belief. Even when a person behaves according to every external rule, the internal experience remains unpredictable. This creates a form of permanent vulnerability. The person is told that certain desires are sinful, Yet the capacity for those desires remains within them. Because the impulse returns, guilt returns. Because guilt returns, forgiveness must be sought repeatedly. The system contains both the wound and the cure. It first teaches you to interpret your nature as evidence of corruption. It then offers reconciliation with the authority whose categories produced the corruption in the first place. The dependency can continue indefinitely. This does not require deliberate conspiracy from every priest, parent, teacher, or believer. Systems often reproduce themselves through people who sincerely believe they are protecting others. A parent transmits shame because shame was presented to them as love. A community polices young people because control has been confused with moral care. A religious leader repeats inherited prohibitions because questioning them would threaten the structure of meaning on which their own identity depends. The result can be domination without a single architect directing every part. Like a chain whose links were forged in different centuries, the structure continues because each generation receives one piece and passes it forward. The most effective stage arrives when external punishment is no longer necessary. At first, a child may be corrected for touching their own body, asking a question, expressing curiosity, or noticing attraction. They learn from facial expressions before they understand doctrine. A sudden silence, a look of disgust, a warning about impurity, these reactions enter memory. Over time, the authority moves inward. Years later, no parent, teacher, or religious official needs to be present. The adult experiences desire and immediately performs the punishment internally. They become both accused and judge. They hide from themselves. This is the perfect prison because it does not look like a prison. There are no visible walls. The person may even defend the structure, believing the pain proves their virtue. But consider what has happened psychologically. An entire region of inner life has become inaccessible to honest thought. Every desire entering that region is intercepted by shame before it can be understood. The individual loses information about themselves. They may no longer know the difference between genuine conviction and conditioned fear. The system no longer governs merely through rules. It governs perception. It determines what the person is capable of seeing without panic. This is why the statement, "the guilt was installed," can be so disturbing. It suggests that an emotion experienced as deeply personal may have a social history. The shame feels intimate, yet the language through which it speaks may have been inherited. You are dirty. You are impure. Something is wrong with you. You must never let anyone know. Whose voice is that? Is it the voice of reason? Does it explain harm, causality, responsibility, or the rights of others? Or does it simply condemn existence? A rational moral insight can give reasons. It can identify consequences. It can distinguish between an impulse and an action. It can explain why coercion, betrayal, or exploitation diminishes human flourishing. Shame usually does something else. It collapses the distinction between what you feel and what you are. You do not merely have a desire. You become a bad person for having it. Once identity itself is condemned, the need for external redemption grows stronger. The person is no longer correcting a particular harmful behavior. They are attempting to escape their own being. This is one reason sexual regulation has often extended far beyond individual spirituality into family organization, law, inheritance, gender hierarchy, and social status. Control of sexuality can become control of reproduction. Control of reproduction can determine lineage, property, labor, and family authority. The regulation of desire is therefore never only private. It can serve broader systems of social organization. Historically, these burdens have often fallen more severely on women. Their bodies have been treated as symbols of family honor, community purity, male status, and religious obedience. The same behavior that is excused in men may be treated as permanent contamination in women. Such inequality is not incidental. When a woman's sexuality is controlled, her choices concerning partnership, marriage, reproduction, economic independence, and public identity can also be controlled. Spinoza did not formulate a modern feminist theory. His own historical world contained limitations that must not be ignored. Yet the logic of his philosophy undermines the foundation on which bodily domination depends. If mind and body are not enemies, the body cannot automatically be treated as inferior. If each person strives according to their own nature, no individual exists merely as an instrument for another's social order. If freedom grows through understanding, then enforced ignorance about one's own body is a form of disempowerment. If joy involves an increase in the power to act, a moral system that reduces people to fear, silence, and dependency must be questioned. The implications extend to everyone whose bodily life has been defined from the outside. The philosophical issue is not whether all desires are wise. They are not. The issue is whether an authority can condemn a person's inner experience before that experience has been rationally examined. This same logic migrated beyond explicitly religious institutions. Families inherited it. Schools reproduced it. Laws translated it into formal categories. Popular culture often appeared to reject sexual repression while continuing to exploit insecurity, turning the body from an object of religious shame into an object of commercial judgment. The language changed, but the alienation remained. One system says your body is sinful. Another says your body is inadequate. One offers forgiveness. The other offers products, procedures, status, and endless self-modification. Both can profit when you do not feel at home in yourself. This is the broader political dimension of Spinoza's insight. A person disconnected from their own nature is easier to redirect. When you do not trust your own internal experience, you search outside yourself for instructions about what to desire. Religious authority may tell you which desires are holy. Political authority may tell you which bodies are dangerous. Commercial authority may tell you which appearance will make you worthy. Social media may tell you which performance will make you visible. Each competes to occupy the space left empty by self-knowledge. The person becomes a consumer of identity. They wait to be told what a successful body looks like, what a respectable relationship looks like, what acceptable pleasure looks like, and what kind of life deserves approval. Spinoza's response is not simply to reject every influence. No person exists independently of society. We are formed through relationships, language, history, and institutions. The task is to understand these causes, rather than pretending they do not affect us. Which of your desires arose from your deepest capacities? Which were shaped by fear? Which were manufactured by comparison? Which express a genuine movement toward connection? Which are attempts to obtain approval from people who taught you to reject yourself? Without this investigation, rebellion can become another form of obedience. A person may violate every inherited rule and still remain governed by it, defining their entire life in opposition to what they were forbidden to be. Spinozist freedom is quieter. It does not need constant conflict with the old authority, because it no longer allows that authority to determine the terms of existence. The goal is not merely to escape the prison. It is to stop carrying the prison's architecture within the mind, and that can happen only when guilt is replaced by understanding. Understanding desire is far more demanding than either suppression or permission. Suppression gives a simple command: do not feel, do not ask, do not examine. Permission can become equally simple: feel whatever appears and assume that authenticity requires acting upon it. Spinoza offers neither simplicity. He asks us to investigate the structure of our emotional life. In his philosophy, human beings are continually affected by encounters. A word, a memory, a body, an image, a rejection, an act of kindness, or a sudden absence can alter our state. These encounters may increase our power to act or diminish it, yet we are often unaware of the causes involved. We experience the final emotion without seeing the process that produced it. We feel attraction and call it destiny. We feel fear and call it intuition. We feel jealousy and call it love. We feel dependency and call it devotion. We feel shame and call it morality. The name we give an emotion can conceal more than it reveals. This is why self-knowledge cannot mean merely trusting every feeling. A feeling is real as an experience, but our interpretation of it may be confused. You may genuinely desire someone while misunderstanding why. Perhaps the person resembles an earlier source of affection. Perhaps their distance activates an old hunger for approval. Perhaps the intensity comes not from compatibility, but from uncertainty. Perhaps the desire expresses a neglected part of yourself that you have projected onto another person. None of this makes the desire false. It makes it caused. And because it is caused, it can be studied. The person who refuses to examine desire because it feels shameful remains passive before it. The person who romanticizes desire as unquestionable truth remains passive in another way. Freedom begins when the desire can be held in awareness, without immediate condemnation and without immediate obedience. Can you remain with what you feel long enough to learn from it? Can you ask what the desire seeks beneath its first image? Is it asking for pleasure, for closeness, for reassurance, for escape, for novelty, for tenderness, for power, For the recovery of a part of yourself you abandoned to gain acceptance? These questions can be uncomfortable because they remove the protection of simple moral categories. It is easier to call a desire sinful than to understand its history. It is easier to call a desire sacred than to examine its consequences. Understanding requires us to see both the dignity and the danger of desire. Sexual desire can create intimacy, joy, trust, and shared vulnerability. It can also become entangled with manipulation, secrecy, domination, self-deception, or attempts to numb emotional pain. The ethical task is not to praise or condemn desire in the abstract. It is to understand what a particular desire becomes within a particular network of relationships. Suppose someone in a committed relationship experiences attraction to another person. A morality based only on guilt may command them to deny the attraction even to themselves. They may insist it does not exist. Yet because it remains unexamined, it may influence their behavior indirectly. They become distant from their partner, idealize the other person, create secret emotional spaces, or grow resentful toward the commitment they have never consciously reconsidered. A morality of impulsive permission might tell them that authenticity requires immediate action. Because the desire is real, they conclude that acting upon it must be honest. Spinoza's framework asks for more. What conditions produce the attraction? What is missing, imagined, or newly awakened? Is the desire revealing a truth about the existing relationship? Or is it repeating a pattern that has appeared many times before? What consequences would follow for everyone involved? Would secrecy expand life or divide it? Would honest conversation increase mutual understanding, even if difficult? Which choice produces a greater capacity for coherent action rather than temporary intensity followed by confusion? No external formula can answer every question in advance, but reason can clarify the field in which the choice is made. This is what it means to move from passive emotion toward active understanding. The emotional life does not disappear. Spinoza is not asking us to become cold. He is asking us to become less enslaved by emotions whose causes remain obscure. The better you understand anger, the less completely anger becomes your identity. The better you understand jealousy, the less easily it can disguise itself as devotion. The better you understand shame, the less authority it possesses merely because it hurts. The better you understand desire, the less likely you are to either bury it or follow it blindly. This kind of self-knowledge can transform relationships. How many relationships have been damaged not by desire itself, but by the inability to speak about it? How many people perform satisfaction because they fear that honesty would make them unworthy of love? How many needs emerge sideways as criticism because directly naming them feels humiliating? How much resentment is created when two people obey an acceptable script while their actual emotional lives remain hidden? A relationship cannot become fully honest when each person treats their inner experience as evidence that may be used against them. Where shame rules, intimacy becomes performance. People reveal only the parts of themselves they believe will be approved. They hide fantasies, uncertainties, changing needs, fears, and disappointments. The hidden material does not vanish. It accumulates behind the public version of the relationship. Eventually, the distance between lived reality and performed respectability becomes unbearable. Spinoza's alternative begins with the courage to know oneself without flinching. This does not mean every thought must be announced, or every private image converted into a demand. Self-knowledge includes discernment, but a truth cannot be communicated responsibly until it has first been admitted internally. The conversation you fear having with another person is often preceded by a conversation you have refused to have with yourself. What am I actually feeling? What am I afraid this feeling means about me? What would remain if the shame were removed? What responsibility still exists after the shame is removed? These questions separate ethics from humiliation. Shame says, because you feel this, you are unworthy. Responsibility says, because your actions affect others, you must understand what you are choosing. The first attacks being, the second clarifies action. A person crushed by shame may appear obedient while remaining psychologically fragmented. A responsible person may make difficult choices, accept limits, apologize for actual harm, and change behavior without concluding that existence itself is a crime. This distinction also changes the meaning of guilt. Not all guilt is manufactured. Remorse can arise when we recognize that we have harmed someone, betrayed trust, or acted against values we genuinely understand. Such remorse can guide repair, but guilt attached merely to the existence of a desire serves no comparable purpose. It does not repair another person because no injury has necessarily occurred. It does not create understanding because it interrupts examination. It does not strengthen character because it teaches self-division. We must therefore ask, does this guilt point toward a specific harm for which I am responsible? Or does it simply repeat the message that my body is unacceptable? That question can expose an entire inherited moral structure, and once exposed, the structure may begin to lose its power. Not dramatically, not all at once. Perhaps freedom first appears as a pause a few seconds between desire and condemnation. In that pause, you do not punish yourself. You do not act impulsively. You observe. You ask. You understand. That pause is small, but philosophically it is revolutionary. It is the moment when the internal prison guard receives no immediate obedience. It is the moment when your inner life becomes available for knowledge. And knowledge, for Spinoza, is not passive information. It is an increase in power. What happens when an entire society refuses that pause? What happens when generation after generation is taught to suppress desire before understanding it? Repression does not eliminate human energy. It changes its form. A desire forced underground may return as obsession. Affection that cannot be expressed may become bitterness. Curiosity treated as corruption may become secrecy. Chronic shame may emerge as hostility toward anyone who appears free from it. This transformation is one of the most destructive consequences of moral systems built on fear. People often imagine repression as strength. The person who never admits desire appears disciplined. The society that covers the body, restricts discussion, and punishes deviation appears orderly. But visible order can conceal internal chaos. A tightly sealed container is not empty. It may be under pressure. When people are trained to experience ordinary parts of themselves as enemies, they may project that conflict outward. The battle within the person becomes a battle against other people. Someone who cannot tolerate their own uncertainty may persecute those who live differently. Someone who has sacrificed pleasure and obedience may become enraged by those who do not make the same sacrifice. Someone who has learned that virtue requires suffering may distrust joy wherever it appears. Cruelty can then disguise itself as moral seriousness. War, punishment, domination, and humiliation may be celebrated as strength, while tenderness, pleasure, and vulnerability are treated as weakness. The inversion is profound. A culture may condemn consensual desire while tolerating violence. It may police private affection while glorifying public destruction. It may speak constantly about purity while protecting institutions where abuse remains hidden. This does not occur because repression makes people more ethical. It occurs because repression directs attention toward visible conformity rather than actual harm. The question becomes, did you violate the rule? Instead of, did you diminish another person's freedom and capacity to live? When morality is organized around contamination, appearances become more important than relationships. A person can preserve a respectable image while acting cruelly. Another can violate convention while treating others with honesty, care, and dignity. Yet the first may receive approval and the second condemnation because the system judges symbols more easily than consequences. Spinoza's philosophy shifts attention back toward causes and effects. Does an action increase understanding? Does it strengthen cooperation? Does it produce trust? Does it support the flourishing of those involved? Or does it generate fear, dependency, deception, and diminished power? These questions may be less dramatic than declarations of purity, but they are more ethically demanding. The consequences of shame-based morality begin within the family. Parents who have never developed a language for the body cannot easily offer one to their children. They may avoid questions, respond with panic, or teach through warning rather than understanding. Children quickly learn which topics create discomfort. They learn to hide before they know what they are hiding. Silence becomes the family's first lesson in sexuality. The second lesson is often fear. Fear of pregnancy, disease, punishment, rejection, dishonor, or divine judgment. Some of these risks are real and deserve serious education. But when fear becomes the entire curriculum, young people are left without the knowledge required for genuine responsibility. They may know that certain actions are dangerous without understanding consent. They may know that desire can produce consequences without knowing how to communicate boundaries. They may know how to avoid being discovered without knowing how to recognize manipulation. They may know the vocabulary of prohibition but lack the vocabulary of emotional honesty. An education that produces ignorance cannot claim moral superiority merely because the ignorance is disciplined. From a Spinozist perspective, understanding is a form of power. To deprive people of accurate knowledge about their bodies, emotions, relationships, and choices is to reduce their ability to act freely. Genuine education would not present the inner life as a minefield. It would teach that desire is neither an unquestionable command nor a stain. It is part of human nature that must be understood in relation to health, consent, commitment, emotional development, social power, and the autonomy of others. Such education would not encourage reckless behavior. It would make manipulation more difficult. A person who understands their own boundaries is harder to pressure. A person who can name desire is less dependent on secrecy. A person who recognizes emotional causes is less vulnerable to someone who exploits loneliness or shame. A person who knows that bodily autonomy belongs to them is less likely to accept the claim that another person, family, institution, or community possesses authority over their body. This is where the critique connects directly to patriarchy. For centuries, control of women's sexuality has been intertwined with inheritance, marriage, legitimacy, property, labor, and male honor. Female desire was often treated as dangerous, not simply because it was considered sinful, but because it threatened arrangements constructed around control of reproduction and family lineage. The woman who chose for herself disrupted more than a moral rule. She disrupted an economic and social order. Religious shame could give that order sacred language. What served human institutions could be presented as the command of heaven. Spinoza's identification of God with nature destabilizes that justification. If divine reality is not a lawgiver resembling a human monarch, then social hierarchies cannot simply project their interests into the sky and return them to earth as eternal decrees. A community must defend its rules through reason and their effects on human flourishing. It cannot rely only on fear. The same analysis applies beyond gender. Authorities have often regulated which relationships are recognized, which bodies are considered respectable, and which forms of affection are permitted public dignity. The argument repeatedly takes the same shape. A particular social arrangement is declared natural, while actual variations within human nature are condemned as violations of nature. Spinoza invites us to look more carefully. Nature is not identical to convention. What a society has repeated for centuries may reveal historical power rather than eternal necessity. To call something unnatural is not an explanation. It is often an attempt to end the conversation before causes, experiences, and consequences can be examined. A society influenced by Spinoza would not abandon every norm. It would become more honest about where norms come from. It would ask which rules protect people from harm and which protect institutions from losing control. It would distinguish responsibility from conformity. It would educate rather than frighten. It would treat consent not as reluctant submission to a rule, but as the active expression of informed persons who understand their own boundaries and recognize the autonomy of others. It would create relationships in which honesty is not punished merely for disrupting an acceptable image. It would reduce the energy spent policing harmless difference and redirect that energy toward violence, coercion, exploitation, and abuse. Most importantly, it would produce people less afraid of themselves. Such people would not be perfectly rational. They would still experience confusion, jealousy, longing, disappointment, and contradiction, but they would possess a language through which these experiences could be examined instead of hidden. That language is politically significant. People who can identify fear are less easily governed by fear. People who recognize manufactured shame are less easily divided by campaigns built around disgust. People who understand their desires are less easily manipulated by religious promises, political scapegoats, or commercial fantasies. A person disconnected from desire can be told what to want. A person who has examined desire becomes harder to redirect. This is why inner freedom is never merely private. Every person who stops treating their body as an enemy weakens a larger economy of control. Every honest conversation interrupts inherited silence. Every act of understanding breaks one link in the chain. But there is still one final danger. After discovering that guilt was imposed, a person may build a new identity entirely around rejecting it. They may turn liberation into another rigid doctrine. They may treat every limit as oppression and every impulse as truth. Spinoza would not accept this. To escape one form of bondage by entering another is not freedom. The final task is more subtle. We must learn how to live without shame while remaining fully responsible for what our desires become in the world. What if some of the parts of yourself you were taught to reject are not evidence of corruption, but invitations to understanding? This question does not offer immediate comfort. It removes a familiar structure. Many of us were given an acceptable version of ourselves before we possessed the language to question it. We learned which emotions could be shown, which questions could be asked, which forms of love could be acknowledged, and which desires had to remain hidden. Some parts were welcomed, others were placed behind an internal door. Over time, we forgot that the door had been constructed. We assumed the separation was natural. We began calling one side, my true self, and the other, everything wrong with me. Then we spent years attempting to protect the approved identity. We adjusted our speech. We edited our memories. We performed certainty. We entered relationships hoping another person would love the version we had been taught to display, while fearing that intimacy might expose everything concealed behind the door. No wonder so many people are exhausted. They are not merely living. They are maintaining an internal border. Spinoza's philosophy does not ask us to destroy every boundary and release every impulse into action. That would not be self-knowledge. It would be another refusal to understand. His challenge is quieter and more radical. Open the door. Look carefully. Do not worship what you find. Do not condemn it. Understand it. The goal is not to replace guilt with unrestricted permission. It is to replace guilt with knowledge. Permission still depends on an authority. Someone grants it. Someone says you are allowed. Understanding requires no such grant. It is built through attention to causes, consequences, relationships, and the actual structure of your emotional life. When you understand a desire, you may choose to act upon it. You may choose to transform it. You may recognize that its surface object is not what you truly need. You may decide that acting would harm someone you love. You may discover that the desire points toward a necessary change you have avoided for years. The outcome cannot be known in advance, because understanding is not a universal command. It is a process. This is why self-knowledge is so threatening to systems based on guilt. A person who does not understand themselves remains dependent on interpretation from outside. They require someone else to define the feeling, diagnose the impurity, prescribe the remedy, and declare when forgiveness has been achieved. A person who understands themselves can still seek counsel, community, philosophy, and spiritual reflection. But these no longer replace their own responsibility. They are resources, not masters. The person has nothing to confess, merely because nature moved within them. They may have actions to account for. They may have harm to repair. They may have promises to reconsider or responsibilities to fulfill. But desire itself is no longer evidence of guilt. This distinction exposes the real taboo. The most threatening act was never simply breaking a sexual rule. Human beings have violated rules in secret throughout history. The greater threat is the person who no longer experiences automatic shame. Shame sustains the structure. Without shame, the individual does not approach authority as a contaminated being begging to be restored. Without shame, a feeling can be examined before it is classified. Without shame, responsibility becomes clearer because it is no longer confused with self-hatred. A person who understands desire, respects the freedom of others, makes conscious decisions, and refuses to condemn themselves merely for being alive has stepped outside the oldest part of the control mechanism. They do not need to rebel theatrically. Their clarity is enough. Spinoza paid heavily for challenging the systems of fear surrounding him. He was expelled from his community while still a young man. His ideas were denounced. His books were banned and attacked. For generations, his name was used as a warning against intellectual danger. Yet the philosophy survived. An institution can prohibit a book. It can punish a thinker. It can frighten a community into silence. But it cannot permanently eliminate a question once the question accurately describes something in human experience. Why does desire become guilt before it becomes action? Who taught the body to fear itself? Who gains authority when people believe their inner nature is fundamentally untrustworthy? What becomes possible when emotion is understood through causes rather than judged through inherited terror? These questions remain because the conflict remains. Even in societies that consider themselves liberated, the body is still surrounded by anxiety. Religious shame may weaken, while commercial shame intensifies. Old prohibitions disappear, while new demands appear. You are told to be free, but only in an attractive way. You are told to express yourself, but only if the expression can be admired. You are told to love your body, while every image around you explains how the body must be changed before it deserves love. The command is no longer simply deny desire. It may become perform desire correctly. The external script survives in a different costume. Spinoza's freedom, therefore, cannot be reduced to adopting a modern identity or rejecting an ancient rule. It requires continuous examination. Which desires increase your capacity to live? Which leave you fragmented? Which relationships allow you to become more truthful? Which require you to disappear? Which pleasures deepen connection? Which function as temporary escapes from pain you refuse to understand? Which forms of guilt point toward real harm? Which merely repeat the voice of an authority that taught you to be ashamed of existing? No philosophy can answer these questions on your behalf. That is precisely the point. Freedom is not receiving the correct list from a more fashionable authority. Freedom is developing the power to understand. What if pleasure can sometimes be a form of knowledge? Not because pleasure is always wise, but because the body may reveal forms of connection, safety, vitality, and recognition that abstract rules cannot detect. What if desire, when neither suppressed nor blindly obeyed, can teach you something about the conditions under which you become more fully alive? What if the body is not an obstacle separating you from meaning, but the medium through which meaning is experienced? Every act of thought occurs through an embodied life. Every friendship, work of art, moment of tenderness, discovery, grief, and joy enters human existence through the unity of mind and body. To despise the body is not to become more spiritual. It may simply divide reality against itself. Spinoza's vision offers another possibility, not transcendence of nature, but a deeper participation in it through understanding. You do not become free by escaping causality. You become freer by seeing more clearly how causes move through you. You do not defeat emotion by becoming numb. You transform your relation to emotion by understanding it. You do not become responsible by hating desire. You become responsible by knowing what desire is doing, where it leads, and how your choices affect the lives entangled with your own. This is not a final destination. It is a daily practice. Today you may understand one fear more clearly than yesterday. Tomorrow you may recognize that a desire you condemned was really a longing for tenderness. Later, you may discover that a pleasure you defended was actually reducing your freedom. Self-knowledge remains unfinished because the network of causes shaping us continues to change. But each increase in understanding weakens the power of automatic shame. The guilt may not disappear immediately. An emotion learned in childhood can survive long after the belief supporting it has been questioned. You may understand intellectually that a desire is not evil and still feel the old contraction in the body. Do not treat that reaction as proof that the old doctrine was correct. Observe it as part of the causal history you are learning to understand. The shame itself has causes. It was repeated, reinforced, connected to fear, embedded in memory. And what was constructed through causes can be transformed through new causes: honest reflection, compassionate relationships, accurate knowledge, embodied safety, and choices made without self-deception. The way out is not rage for its own sake. It is not the rejection of every tradition, community, commitment, or moral boundary. It is the refusal to let unexplained guilt govern the inner life. Know the desire. Know the fear surrounding it. Know the history that gave the fear its language. Know the consequences of your choices. Then act from the clearest understanding available to you. That is the revolution Spinoza's philosophy makes possible. From the outside, it may not look dramatic. It may look like someone pausing before condemning themselves. It may look like an honest conversation between partners. It may look like a parent answering a child's question without transmitting panic. It may look like a person recognizing real harm without collapsing into self-hatred. It may look like someone who has finally stopped apologizing merely for being alive. And if that quiet clarity threatens a system of power, then perhaps the threat reveals something important about the system. So consider the question personally. What part of your inner life have you been treating as an enemy before you have truly understood it? Share your reflection if you are willing. Continue examining the assumptions that shaped your relationship with your body, your desires, and your freedom. And carry this question beyond the video. Are you choosing from understanding, or are you still obeying a guilt whose causes you have never been allowed to see?